Hello, everyone, and welcome to the course. This is a fully online, fully asynchronous, meaning no live meetings, course. IH51, Intellectual Heritage 1, The Good Life. This is a thematic course survey letting you know what the course is meant to do, what we will be reading, why I have determined exact readings that I have, and how I approach the course. Intellectual heritage has been a required course for Temple students for over 40 years. I think it began around 1979, and it has gone through many changes since then. And that's natural because our culture has gone through a lot of changes since then. What is the course? The course started out as a Classics of Western Civilization course. The idea was that American college students should have a familiarity with the classics of their own culture. So that means reading the classics, reading some of the great works of literature, philosophy, religion, science that have been vital and important in shaping Western culture. A lot of things have changed in those last 40 years, one of which is some big doubts about the value of Western culture, or some concerns that in focusing on Western culture, we're being too exclusive or bigoted or prejudiced or imperialistic. I mean, those are really interesting questions. And so there has been some attempt over those 40 years to widen the field to admit non-Western sources, which we will read, depending on what you consider Western. Right? I mean, we'll read things like the Bhagavad Gita and the Quran, which were not initially thought of as being things that students should read, but the thing has widened. The thing has widened in many ways, and there's been a lot of questions about the value of calling something a classic to begin with. And those are all interesting questions, but I still consider the course a classics course. I consider intellectual heritage, both the first and second versions of the course that you'll be taking, as opportunities to familiarize yourself with great works of philosophy, literature, and other fields, I suppose, with great works, great texts, and texts that I think have been important in forming not only Western culture, but world culture, and that give you references and a background that is absolutely wonderful to have as a human being. I mean, it's part of your liberal arts education. This is not a course that's meant to hand on any kind of technical skill or any overtly practical knowledge that will help you navigate through the world. It's philosophical knowledge, really. Knowledge of art, literature, philosophy, history. The kind of things that serve you as a human being, I think, in a very vital sense. So the course is meant to enrich your life, really. I mean, I know that might sound corny and ridiculous, but I try to think of my own life without knowledge of texts like these, and I think it would be much impoverished. These are the kind of texts, we're only dipping into the classics of world civilization, world literature. We're only dipping into it, but these are the kind of texts which I think are absolutely vital for us, as human beings. So that's what the course is about. Let's take a little closer look at the kind of things that we will be reading. The course is more or less broken up into 5 units, each of which has a collection of texts that are related to each other. The first unit is the Old Testament, and that is one way of referring to the Hebrew Bible. Reading Genesis, some excerpts, almost everything we'll read will be excerpts, except for Plato. You can't read Plato in excerpts. Week 1, Genesis, book of Genesis, book of Exodus, book of Job. These are just prominent texts in the Bible, the Old Testament part of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. I can't imagine not knowing these texts. I mean, we won't be reading them as, in terms of their Won't be reading them as believers. I mean, many of us are believers, but we're reading them more or less for their literary and philosophical meaning, which they have great meaning. So whether you're a person whether you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim, and you accept these texts as part of your religious tradition, or you're a secular person, an atheist or agnostic or just free floating, it's meaningful. It's great. I mean, these texts are great. I mean, I'll tell you, I mean, it's really kind of irrelevant, but I'm not a person of any faith. I don't believe in any sort of God. I don't follow any sort of religion, but I'm a great reader of scripture, of not only the Bible, but Bhagavad Gita, the Quran. They're part of my heritage as a human being, and they contain a lot of really interesting things that I think are important for me to be aware of and that enrich my life. So even though I'm an atheist, I have incredible interest in these things. So whether you're a believer in any religion or not, reading from the religious texts of the human species is a great and vital experience. Maybe one of the great experiences of a liberal arts education is reading the Bible in an academic context where it's criticized, analyzed, thought about. It's a great experience. Part 2 of the course is really moving on to Plato. We'll read Plato, the great Greek philosopher, 2,500 years ago, actually. Some shorter works of his, the Euthyphro, which is a dialogue, the Apology, which is Socrates' defense speech when he's brought before the court of Athens for corrupting the youth, and then the Credo, which is the dialogue that takes place between Socrates and his friend Credo when Socrates is in jail, awaiting the death sentence that he's given. Reading Plato is a great experience. Reading Greek philosophy in general is a great experience, and being exposed to ancient Greek culture is a great experience. And again, this is kind of my education. I have my own biases and favorites and things that I know, and I naturally go to them. And reading Plato is one of those things. We'll talk more about Plato. It doesn't really matter that much who he was. He was a philosopher in the 5th and 4th century BC, an Athenian Greek philosopher, and he wrote a bunch of dialogues using his friend Socrates as the main character. Then we will move on to section 3, which is reading 2 plays by a rough contemporary. He was a little older than Plato, came a little bit before, but Sophocles, the 2 of his great plays, Oedipus, King Oedipus, or Oedipus the King, or Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus Tyrannos, depending on how you refer to it, and his Antigone, which is probably my favorite thing, particularly my favorite play, one I know the best. So we'll be reading that. I mean, Greek tragedy is an incredibly important thing in human history, and we'll be reading a couple of Greek tragedies. Then in Unit 4 is kind of like, I don't want to call it a hodgepodge, but is a collection of further religious and philosophical works grouped together. We'll be reading some excerpts from the Bhagavad Gita, the great Hindu religious and philosophical text, which is something I read later in life. It did not form a part of my formal education, but certainly has been incredibly important, especially philosophically, in my shaping of my view of philosophy and religion and human existence. Just a great, wonderful, great work from, again, about 2,000 years ago. Obviously, written in Sanskrit a long time ago and translated into English. The Bhagavad Gita, some things from the New Testament, letter of James, some excerpts from Paul's letter to the Romans, and a short excerpt from the Gospel of Matthew, but the Sermon on the Mount. Chapters 5 through 7 couldn't be a more important part of the Bible, at least in terms of its influence on human history. And then some excerpts from the Quran, which is, not really my specialty. I'm certainly an amateur reader of the Quran, but incredibly interesting and important, obviously. And then finally, the 5th and last part of the course I'm calling stories. because they all are stories and they all have an interesting relationship with each other, I think. They're written at very different times by very different people about very different characters, but you might even call them the sort of archetypical story of the hero, the ancient Babylonian story of Gilgamesh, which is a wonderful text that comes from that wonderful lost civilization of Sumeria. It was around for thousands of years and then it's more or less went out of existence. But they've left us this wonderful story, unfortunately not in full form because it was dug up on clay tablets in partial form. The wonderful story of Gilgamesh, story of the hero king Gilgamesh. And then the 18th century story of the hero, not a king, and maybe not very heroic, Candide, Voltaire's great satire, and incredibly wonderful and disturbing, in many ways quite horrible, but still funny story of Candide in the 18th century, story of one person sort of looking for wisdom. And then maybe the greatest sort of 20th century hero's journey, Siddhartha, the great novel by the 20th century German novelist Hermann Hesse, about a seeker of wisdom in ancient India. 20th century novel about ancient India, and what a wonderful novel it is and a wonderful way to end things. I'm calling this thing stories, but it's really kind of the story of the hero and the story of the hero who is seeking enlightenment and truth. These wonderful books. So we're dipping into some of the great pieces of literature and philosophy of world civilization. And why are we doing that? Because they're great. That's why we're doing it, because everybody should know these things or things like these things. Right? Can't know them all, but just wonderful classic works which will enrich you, which will enrich your thinking about the world. I guarantee if you take them seriously enough to read them carefully and think about them and write about them, you will get a lot out of them. This course is not about me. I'm just a guy who teaches IH and things like that. So I'm nobody, and certainly nobody special, but the books we'll be reading, the texts we'll be reading, that's what the course is about, and they're special. So welcome to the course. I think it'll be a lot of fun. And the more you read, the more actively you involve yourself in these readings, the more fun you will have, and the more you'll get out of it.